Welcome back to, my name is Brenda.
The learning objectives for part.
In this section, we'll be covering, so step 7 is to enhance gut flora. And we've already talked a fair bit about dysbiosis and problems of dysbiosis being a driver of insulin resistance. So we'll go into a little more detail.
An unhealthy microbiota contributes to chronic inflammation, insulin resistance, and the development of type 2 diabetes and all of its related complications.
So how does dysbiosis actually fuel insulin resistance? Well, the key mechanisms of action include, number 1, it increases gut permeability. Number 2, it increases the production of pro-inflammatory proteins called cytokines. And number 3, it induces metabolic endotoxemia. And this is basically a condition in which the lipopolysaccharides from dead gram-negative bacteria enter the bloodstream, initiating a cascade of pro-inflammatory mediators. Healthy microbes actually help to fight diabetes. There was a 2018 randomized controlled trial that reported a select group of short-chain fatty acid producing bacterial strains is promoted by dietary fiber, and that most other potential producers were either diminished or unchanged in patients with type 2 diabetes. When the fiber-promoted short-chain fatty acid producers were present in even greater diversity and abundance, participants had improved hemoglobin A1C levels. And the authors concluded that targeted restoration of these short-chain fatty acid producers may actually present a novel ecological approach for managing type 2 diabetes. So to improve gut flora, we want to begin by eating a diet that's high in prebiotics, or the food for our friendly bacteria. That's coming mainly from legumes like beans and lentils, whole grains, asparagus, artichokes, bananas, onions, and garlic. Secondly, we would want to be eating food-based probiotics as part of our regular diet, and we would get that from things like yogurt, preferably non-dairy yogurt, fermented vegetables, sauerkraut, tempeh, and miso. We want to minimize our intake of foods that foster the growth of bad bacteria. And this includes processed foods, fried food, even meat, especially red meat, and refined carbohydrates. We want to take probiotics, especially if we're using antibiotics. Avoid artificial sweeteners, which can hurt our gut microbiota, and avoid excessive alcohol consumption.
Now, step 8 is to maximize anti-inflammatory, phytochemical, and antioxidant-rich foods.
In the Cardia study done in 2016 on inflammation, oxidative stress, and diabetes risk, there were 2,339 participants that were diabetes-free and followed for 10 years. 9.5% of those individuals involved actually went on to develop type 2 diabetes.
Here we want to really...
In the Cardia study done in 2016 on inflammation, oxidative stress, and diabetes risk.
Here we want to really focus on loading up on anti-inflammatory, antioxidant-rich food. So we know about the phytochemical-rich veggies and fruits, but the superheroes of that category would be our dark green leafies, our berries, onions and garlic, beets, tomatoes, peppers. Even the cruciferous vegetable family is very important here. And then all the herbs and spices, we talked about some of them earlier, but turmeric, ginger, cayenne, cloves, sage, rosemary, thyme, oregano, basil, cinnamon, nutmeg, pepper are all very rich in phytochemicals and antioxidants. And then the legumes, nuts, seeds, and whole grains, sprouted foods. Sprouted foods are so interesting because in some sprouts, you get the bioactive compounds being 4 or 5 times higher than they would be in the mature food. And in some cases, as much as 50 times higher. So it's you can get a real boost in phytochemicals with sprouted food. For example, broccoli sprouts have about 50 times higher sulforaphane content than mature broccoli. And then we have, of course, fermented foods and green tea as being other sources, and other herbal teas as well can be quite sources of antioxidants.
One of the things that you would want to be doing is to really think color as you purchase and prepare food. The richest sources of phytochemicals and antioxidants are generally the most colorful. For example, you want to choose darker rather than lighter greens. Choose purple, green, or orange cauliflower instead of white, or purple instead of white onions. You want to select colorful potatoes like deep orange or purple instead of white potatoes. This whole color thing applies not only to fruits and vegetables, but to other foods as well, like grains and legumes, even nuts and seeds. There's a greater concentration of phytochemicals in red or black compared to brown rice, or in black or red beans compared to white beans. This doesn't mean you should avoid white beans or brown rice, but rather just that it can be helpful to recognize that you can boost your level of protective components by including more of these colorful choices at least some of the time. One thing that we can do to enhance our array of phytochemicals and antioxidants is to think variety. And that means not always eating the same thing at each meal. And so we want to get variety within each food group. So for example, if you typically have a breakfast bowl with grains and fruits and nuts and seeds on top, vary each of those. So instead of always having rolled oats or steel cut oats, you might have kamut berries or barley or quinoa. Try different berries, try different fruits, vary the nuts and seeds on top. It's the same with salads. When you make a salad, don't make it always romaine lettuce. So sometimes romaine lettuce, but mix in some wild greens, kale and collards and so forth. So you get a wider combination of greens. And then again, mix up the types and colors of fruits and vegetables that would go on that. Same story for legumes. Don't make it always black beans. Try the whole spectrum of beans and lentils and split peas and so forth. The greater the variety of antioxidants and phytochemicals that you will be consuming.
The next thing you want to do is to pile on the herbs and spices. And again, these are among our most concentrated phytochemical factories. They are highly, highly rich in phytochemicals and antioxidants, and they add almost no calories. They add a lot of flavor, and they add color to your meals. So one of the things that I would suggest is to think about with each meal how you can actually add these wonderful compounds. So for breakfast, for example, breakfast is a meal we traditionally don't have a lot of herbs and spices. So if you're doing a breakfast bowl, you might want to add in some cinnamon, some cloves, some fresh grated nutmeg, maybe some cardamom, but those spices work with a sweet breakfast bowl very well. If you're doing a savory breakfast bowl, then your range of options are even greater. You can use rosemary and turmeric and garlic and all sorts of things. So just be really conscious at each meal of trying to add in a little herb and spice. Another thing that you are wise to do is to eat more raw food. So raw foods are more concentrated in phytochemicals and retain phytochemicals that may be lost in cooking. Now, we do know cooking actually can increase the absorption of some phytochemicals because of the breakdown of plant cell walls, for example, carotenoids. But even if you look at carotenoids and you compare carotenoids in a raw carrot versus a cooked carrot, it's higher in the cooked carrot. But if you take that raw carrot and juice it, the availability is even higher from the juice. So certainly the processing of raw food, doing a spread or something like that in the food processor could again increase the availability of these compounds. But generally, it's better, more phytochemicals coming from raw food. And then we also have enzymes in cruciferous and allium vegetables that help to convert phytochemicals into their bioactive metabolite. So for example, in cruciferous vegetables, we have myrosinase, which convert glucosinolates into isothiocyanates, and in the allium vegetables, allan to allicin. And this is really important because the active forms, of course, will have a greater impact. Now, if you cook these foods, then you lose some of the myrosinase and the allanase. But if you cut them up first and you let them sit so you get the conversion happening before you cook it, then that's a way of improving the content of the more active forms. Another thing you can do is to start sprouting, and we've mentioned sprouting on several occasions, even mentioning that phytochemicals can be 4 or 5 to 50 times higher in sprouts than mature plants. There was actually a study in 2013 that reported that broccoli sprouts, which of course are high in sulforaphane, increased total antioxidant capacity of plasma, decreased oxidative stress index, decreased lipid peroxidation, serum triglycerides, oxidized LDL, which of course is the most atherogenic type of LDL particle, and decreased serum insulin, insulin resistance, and serum high sensitivity C-reactive protein in people with type 2 diabetes. So this to me is really encouraging, and I think it's a reason to seriously consider finding a good source of sprouts or even thinking about growing them yourself. And then, of course, we need to minimize inflammatory foods and pro-oxidants. And this, we're talking about highly processed foods, fast and fried food, refined carbohydrates, high-fat meat and dairy, red meat, processed meat, foods containing trans fats, gluten for people that are sensitive to gluten or whatever foods one might be sensitive to, and alcohol. And the picture on this page, I just couldn't believe it. I was trying to find a picture of what I would think was the most pro-inflammatory food that I could imagine. And this is a burger. It's like a keto burger, which is bun. Is not actually a bun. It's actually some sort of deep fried chicken patty. And then you got the macaroni and cheese and the bacon and all of the other meat and slugging it down with a beer. That is pretty much the most pro-inflammatory thing that I could find. So moving right along to step number 9. Step number 9 is to minimize dietary contaminants. And this again is something that a lot of people aren't terribly aware of. And what we want to talk about here is a number of what I might consider to be the worst offenders. And so specifically environmental contaminants and of course the products of high temperature cooking we'll focus on. The damage done with exposure, especially to environmental chemicals, but to both environmental chemicals and products of high temperature cooking, the chemicals formed can wreak havoc in many ways. They can cause oxidative stress, they can fuel inflammation, they can disrupt hormones, becoming obesogenic, they can damage our vital organs, they can damage DNA and the central nervous system, and by doing so, they can increase risk of diabetes and all of the complications associated with diabetes.
So more specifically, environmental contaminants include pesticides, which are most concentrated in conventional produce, heavy metals such as mercury, found primarily in fish and seafood, and arsenic, which can accumulate in rice, chicken, fish, and seaweed. And for those using rice as a dietary staple, arsenic content can be a significant issue. And it doesn't even matter whether the rice is organic. It matters where the rice is grown. It matters how much arsenic is in the soil. The highest content of arsenic is found in rice grown in former cotton fields that used arsenic-based pesticides. So in the United States, for example, rice grown in California has the least or the lowest amounts of arsenic, whereas rice grown from Texas or Arkansas is much higher. And another troublesome source of arsenic is actually hijiki seaweed. It's so high in arsenic that several governments in the world have issued warnings against its use. And then we've got persistent organic pollutants, or POPs, such as PCBs, DDT, and dioxins, which are most concentrated in fish, meat, and dairy products. And then finally, packaging materials like lead, tin, and BPA can all serve as obesogens, which contributes, of course, to the risk of diabetes.
So the solutions here? Well, the first and obvious solution is to choose organic when you can. And it's true, organic foods are certainly more costly, but if you're creative, you can come up with some reasonable ways of getting organic produce at a discount, getting ugly produce, growing it yourself, subscribing to an organic delivery service. We can always find ways around cost.
One of the most useful tools for consumers is the Environmental Working Groups, or EWGs, Shopper's Guide to Pesticides in Produce, which has been released annually since 2004. The EWG analyzes test data from the Department of Agriculture and the Food and Drug Administration so they can educate the public about the vegetables and fruits with the highest and lowest pesticide residues. In 2002, 46 types of vegetables and fruits were included in their analysis. Based on the results, the EWG puts together two lists, one that highlights the 15 types of produce that are the least contaminated. Products on this list are known as the Clean 15. The second list highlights 12 types of produce with the greatest levels of contamination. Products on this list are known as the Dirty Dozen. These lists can help consumers who want to reduce pesticides without breaking the bank. For these individuals, it makes sense to stick to organic when purchasing items that appear on the Dirty Dozen list, while opting for conventional produce when purchasing items that appear on the Clean 15 list.
And the second thing that we can do is just to eat lower on the food chain, which of course is another one of the beauties of a plant-based diet, because we got all the health benefits, but you're also minimizing environmental contaminants when you eat lower on the food chain. And then we mentioned about arsenic in rice. We want to vary our grains for that reason. There are a lot of cultures that use rice as a significant dietary staple, and in some cases where they're eating rice 3 times a day or at least twice a day. So we do need to know that arsenic can injure pancreatic beta cells, altering insulin production and insulin function. And rice products do contain inorganic arsenic, which is the most dangerous form of arsenic. The way to deal with this is just to eat a variety of grains. When you're eating rice, you can actually wash the rice really well and cook it in a large amount of water. If you use 5 parts water to 1 part rice and then drain it, you do get rid of a significant portion of the arsenic. Also, you can look up on the internet, there are lists of where rice comes from and how contaminated it is, so that you can try to see what the source of your rice is and select rice from places that are less contaminated with arsenic. And then use foods without excessive packaging and jars instead of cans, or BPA-free packaging materials. Some cans actually state clearly on the label that they're BPA-free, but of course jars are always a safe bet. For example, when I buy my canned tomatoes, I buy it in glass, and find if you go to the Mediterranean market or some sort of ethnic shop, sometimes they'll be in glass, but often glass is a little more expensive, so it is a consideration for people. So moving on to the products of high temperature cooking, here we're going to talk a little bit about acrylamide, advanced glycation end products, heterocyclic amines, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And I know that's a little bit of a mouthful, but these compounds really are important to be aware of and to think about as we're preparing our foods. So in the Nurses' Health Study and the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, and this it was over 135,000 participants, open flame and high temperature cooking of meat, chicken, or fish more than 15 times a month versus less than 4 times a month increased type 2 diabetes risk by 28%. So it definitely can contribute to the development and progression of this disease. Heterocyclic amines are known carcinogens, and their intake has been associated with increased diabetes risk. They form when we cook meat, poultry, fish, and eggs at high temperatures. Plants actually can't form heterocyclic amines because they don't contain creatine or creatinine. So again, another reason why plant-based diets may offer a bit of an advantage. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are known mutagens. They're linked with lung, skin, and genitourinary cancers. There was a 2018 study that reported a positive association between polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and type 2 diabetes. These compounds are present in charred foods, but even in foods that are just very browned. So they form from the incomplete burning of carbon-containing substances heated above 392 degrees Fahrenheit. And so you've got the picture of toast here from the lightest to the darkest, and you definitely know that you're increasing polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons as you get closer to the dark side. And so one of the things just to be conscious of is how much we're browning food, because with this particular compound, it doesn't matter if it's animal or plant, anything that's blackened will form polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons.
Acrylamide is a chemical that forms when foods are fried or cooked with dry heat, such as baking, roasting, or grilling. Acrylamide forms as part of the Maillard reaction when the amino acid asparagine reacts with sugars such as glucose and fructose. It's a probable human carcinogen and an endocrine disruptor. About half of our dietary exposure is from potato products such as French fries and potato chips. And this is because potatoes are concentrated sources of asparagine. Other significant dietary sources are coffee, bread, toast, baked goods, crisp breads, and crackers. Looking at the amount of acrylamide in some common foods, you can see why potato products are by far our greatest sources. A typical 2.5 ounce serving of French fries provides about 30 micrograms of acrylamide, while a 1 ounce serving of potato chips has about 11 micrograms. It's important, however, to recognize that a standard bag of potato chips is about 10 ounces. So if you eat the whole thing, you'd be getting about 110 micrograms of acrylamide. A typical 2.5 ounce serving of French fries provides about 30 micrograms of acrylamide. A 1 ounce serving of potato chips has about 11 micrograms. But it's important to recognize that a standard bag of potato chips is about 10 ounces. So if you ate the whole thing, you'd be getting about 110 micrograms of acrylamide. A 12.5 ounce cup of coffee provides about 4 micrograms, and 3 standard size commercial cookies provides about 2 micrograms.
And last, but definitely not least, are the advanced glycation end products, or AGEs, which are of particular interest to people with diabetes. They are formed inside the body when fat or protein becomes glycated by sugar, and their production is actually accelerated by hyperglycemia. So it's a really big concern for those with uncontrolled diabetes. They can also be formed outside the body when foods are cooked at high temperatures. The levels of AGEs are significantly higher for individuals with type 2 diabetes or prediabetes than for people without these diseases. AGEs contribute to insulin resistance and many of the complications associated with diabetes. They actually damage both structural and functional proteins, contributing to the development and progression of retinopathy, nephropathy, neuropathy, and cardiomyopathy. So this is something that we really do need to be aware of.
Advanced glycation end products in common foods. This is so interesting to me to see the actual amount in kilo units. Bacon at the top of the chart, over 23,000, almost 24,000. Broiled frankfurters, over 10,000. Boiled frankfurters, over 7,000. Then you've got grilled, fried meat, poultry, or fish, over 5,000. But even a tablespoon of butter came in at 4,000. Grilled or fried tofu is also a source. So even the plant foods, grilling or frying, will produce some advanced glycation end products. And then almost all other foods, even roasted nuts or seeds, will come in with a reasonable amount of these compounds. So the solutions here, we want to focus our diet on whole plant foods.
You want to use moist cooking methods, such as steaming, stewing, boiling, and water sauteing, most often because they produce the fewest products of oxidation. When you're using dry heat, you'll want to use the lowest temperatures possible. For example, you might roast nuts at 250 degrees Fahrenheit instead of 350 degrees
to minimize the products of oxidation.
And of course, we want to be savvy with dry heat. I know we've mentioned this before, but it is worth mentioning again. You want to avoid cooking with oil. And if you do use oil, never allow it to get to the smoking point. Use the lowest temperatures possible when cooking foods, and of course, avoid blackening foods.
And then again, more raw food options. Raw foods don't have.
And of course, we want to be savvy with dry heat. I know we've mentioned this before, but it is worth mentioning again. You want to avoid cooking with oil. And if you do use oil, never allow it to get to the smoking point. Use the lowest temperatures possible when cooking foods, and of course, avoid blackening foods.
And then again, more raw food options. Raw foods don't have. They have minimal of these products of high temperature cooking because obviously they're not being cooked. Some can be formed in dehydrated foods, but again, it's a low temperature, so the amounts would be very small.
And finally, when we think about nuts and seeds, it's worth considering the benefits of soaking and dehydrating over roasting. Roasting nuts and seeds can produce acrylamide and other products of oxidation, especially if we're roasting above 266 degrees Fahrenheit, which of course most nuts and seeds are roasted at 300 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. And roasted nuts and seeds also often contain added oils, salt, or sugar, especially the commercial products. Roasting does, however, have some advantages as well. It tends to bring out the nutty flavor, which of course is why we do it. And it reduces anti-nutrients like phytates, so that can be an advantage. So roasting, when you think about it, roasting produces some good and some not so good effects, whereas with soaking and sprouting, it's all good. We reduce anti-nutrients, we release stored forms of nutrients, we increase phytochemical content, we minimize products of oxidation. And the way that we can easily soak and sprout or soak and dehydrate is simply to soak nuts and seeds for about 4 to 8 hours, depending on the size of the nut or seed. Large nuts need more time, and I find almonds take the longest of all. If you do them for a full 24 hours, that's probably optimal. And then we drain them, rinse them, and dehydrate for about 12 to 24 hours.
We are now on step 10, which is to select mostly whole, unprocessed, or minimally processed foods. Unprocessed foods are foods as grown. There's nothing harmful added. There's nothing healthful that is taken away or removed. When we think about highly processed foods are foods with added fat, sugar, and salt. They induce overeating. They induce non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, insulin resistance, and diabetes. All processed foods are not created. When we think about highly processed foods are foods with added. All processed foods are not created equal. There are minimally processed foods, moderately processed foods, and ultra-processed foods. And of course, we want to absolutely get rid of ultra-processed foods. We want to minimize moderately processed foods, and we certainly can enjoy some minimally processed foods in the diet. So let's take a look at what those are. Well, minimally processed foods are products that have very limited processing at home or commercially, and few, if any, added ingredients. So examples would be blended soups or smoothies, bagged salads, frozen vegetables and fruits, hummus, canned beans. So these would be minimally processed and are certainly fine to be including in the diet. Examples of moderately processed foods are foods with a higher degree of processing and a small number of ingredients added for preservation or flavor. Examples here might be healthy salad dressings or pasta sauces, ready-to-eat cereal, canned soups or stews. Some frozen entrees would fit into this category as well. And then the ultra-processed foods are foods made entirely or mostly of substances that have been extracted from whole foods. So here we're talking about oils and starches and sugars and proteins that have been extracted from whole foods. And generally, when they are made into something else, they have added sugar, fat, salt, color, flavor, preservatives. And good examples would be soda and candy and savory snack foods, mayonnaise, processed meat, veggie meats, packaged baked goods, instant soups are all good examples. And these foods we really want to get rid of. It's okay to use a little bit of starch, for example, as a thickener for something, but you really want to absolutely minimize your use of these foods. And then you would want to avoid highly processed foods with added fat, sugar, and salt as well. And one of the things that I think it's important to recognize with these highly processed foods is that they have some addictive qualities. And if you haven't read this book, Salt, Sugar, and Fat, it's really quite fat. And then you would want to avoid highly processed foods with added fat, sugar, and salt as well. And one of the things that I think it's important to recognize with these highly processed foods is that they have some addictive qualities. And if you haven't read this book, Salt, Sugar, and Fat, it's really quite fascinating how food manufacturing industries have figured out a way to fool our appetite control centers. So when you eat foods in nature, the flavors of salt, fat, and sugar are actually quite dilute, and they draw us to those natural foods for survival. So these are foods that are safe to eat. But what we've done is we've taken and extracted those flavors, concentrated them in foods, and so our appetite control center gets completely overwhelmed, and we can't stop eating, because what the manufacturers are aiming to do with these foods is to allow us to hit this bliss point and to make the foods what we call ultra palatable, so that it's really hard to stop eating them. Not only that, they become addictive, where we just crave them all the time. And the only way really to overcome this problem is to stop eating them, stop having them in your home, and don't look at them as food. They're not food. This can take some time, and you might need some support through it for people that are very addicted to these kinds of foods. You can't reverse diabetes, certainly, by including these kinds of foods in your diet. I want to just say a few words about salt, and salt is, of course, our number one food additive. The upper limits recommended by the American Heart Association for people with type 2 diabetes would be about 1,500 milligrams per day. And those with hypertension face an even greater risk with increased sodium intakes. And the reason for that is patients with type 2 diabetes are at increased risk for cardiovascular disease and kidney disease, and those with hypertension face even greater risk with increased sodium intake. So we need to be just really cautious about how much sodium is in the diet.
There are some great trials assessing sodium intake and diabetes complications as well. One study reported that after adjustment for confounders, the hazard ratio for cardiovascular disease in people with type 2 diabetes increased with increasing sodium intake. Those in the highest quartile had over double the risk of cardiovascular disease compared to those in the lowest quartile. And among patients who had A1Cs of over 9%, the hazard ratio for cardiovascular disease in patients in the top versus bottom quartile of sodium intake was almost 10 times that of those with A1Cs under 9%. So sodium consumption certainly deserves serious consideration with any effective dietary protocol.
So actual intakes, well, average sodium intakes in 296 people with type 2 diabetes was 3,214 milligrams a day. And that's actually lower than the national average. In men, I think the average is closer to 4,000, and in women, it's around the 3,200 as well. But only 20% of the people in the trial actually consumed less than 2,300 milligrams. Only 2.4% met the current recommendations to limit sodium to 1,500 milligrams. So this is just not happening, and so we really need to figure out how to help people to get there. And the number one thing that we have to realize is 75 to 80% of the sodium in the diet comes from processed foods. So when you cut out processed foods, you cut out a whole lot of sodium.
So how much sodium do foods contain? Well, as a reference point, 1 teaspoon of salt has about 2,300 milligrams of sodium. A pack of ramen noodles has about 1,400 to 1,800 depending on the chosen flavor. one big dill pickle over 1,000 milligrams, a cup of canned soup over 800 milligrams, and just a half a cup of tomato sauce over 600 milligrams. A veggie burger, just a one patty, has about 300 to 500 milligrams of sodium. 2 tablespoons of Italian dressing provides about 350 milligrams. A cup of raisin bran, about 225. An ounce of potato chips comes in at about 149 milligrams, and roasted salted peanuts at about 123 milligrams. So the shocker here is that a serving of potato chips or peanuts has less salt than a cup of raisin bran, and eating both the potato chips and the peanuts provides less sodium than what you'd get from a serving of Italian dressing. So we really do need to teach patients to read labels.
So step 11 is to meet needs for micronutrients, which means the vitamins and minerals in our food. And people with diabetes often have micronutrient deficiencies. So choosing nutrient-dense foods helps to ensure adequate nutrients when calories are restricted especially. So you can imagine if someone who has diabetes is on a 1,500 calorie diet trying to lose weight, they still need the same amount of protein and iron and zinc and chromium and magnesium and selenium and all of the other trace minerals that we need. But they've got to get them with only 1,500 calories of food compared to the average person who might eat 2,000 or 2,400. And in that case, that means that their food needs to be nutrient dense. You've got to be getting a lot of nutrients per calorie in order to meet your nutrient requirements. So the micronutrients that are most often of concern in people with diabetes are vitamin B12, vitamin D, potassium, magnesium, the antioxidant nutrients, including vitamin A, of course, has provitamin A carotenoids because vitamin A from animal products doesn't have any antioxidant activity. Vitamin C, vitamin E, and chromium. Eating a well-designed whole foods plant-based diet ensures sufficient amounts of the nutrients of concern with the possible exceptions of B12 and vitamin D. And so those are the 2 nutrients we'll take a quick peek at here today. So vitamin B12 is an issue, especially for people on metformin, because metformin use can reduce B12 absorption, and B12 deficiency can present as peripheral neuropathy or dementia, and so it can be easily missed. Low levels of B12 can negatively affect fasting glucose, oxidative stress, and inflammatory markers in people with diabetes. And a reliable source of B12, either supplements or B12 fortified foods, are essential for people with diabetes. I mean, everyone needs a reliable source. So how much B12 do people need? Well, for people who are 65 years of age or more, and all adults who are on metformin, a daily supplement providing about 100 to 1,000 micrograms of B12 is recommended. B12 level status should be monitored, and if you're a physician working with people with diabetes, it's not a bad idea just to get them tested. And it's important to recognize that people who are over 50 tend not to be able to cleave the B12 off the protein it's bound to in animal products. And so you can end up thinking you've got good sources of B12 when in fact you're not able to cleave the B12 off the protein it's bound to. And so for anyone over 50, it's important to realize that and to know that you need to be getting your B12 from fortified foods or supplements as opposed to from animal products. Adults who are under 65 can use a B12 supplement of 25 to 100 micrograms of B12 per day. They can use a supplement 2 or 3 times a week, providing at least 1,000 micrograms, or consuming at least 3 servings of B12 fortified foods, providing at least 2 micrograms of B12 per serving. You know, you might have a little bit in your fortified almond milk or soy milk or whatever kind of non-dairy milk, and a little bit in nutritional yeast, and just getting little bits like that throughout the day. But it's really important to make sure that there is a reliable source provided. And with vitamin D, low levels of vitamin D have been linked with diabetes onset and progression. Evidence regarding vitamin D and insulin resistance is fairly mixed, though. Vitamin D is a modulator of inflammation and beta cell survival, and evidence is building that good vitamin D status is protective. The reliable sources, of course, are sunshine, fortified foods, and supplements. The one thing that we need need to be aware of is even if you're exposed to what you would think would be adequate sunshine, like a half an hour a day or whatever, winter sun or cool sun will not be helpful in producing vitamin D. It needs to be warm sunshine. And also people who are overweight are not very good at making the active form of vitamin D from sunshine. So they need more sunshine, or they need to look at fortified foods or supplements. The problem with fortified foods is none of them are very highly fortified. So it's actually fairly challenging to get enough vitamin D from fortified foods. So in many people's cases, supplements make sense. And during the winter months, supplements make a lot of sense. What would we be suggesting? Well, 1,000 is a reasonable sort of target for most people. Some people need more. So again, it makes sense to get your levels tested and so that you know where you're at. Here are the Institute of Medicine's recommendations for vitamin D, and it's 15 micrograms or 600 IUs for people 1 to 70 years of age, and 20 micrograms or 800 IUs for people over 70. So as we get older, our ability to make vitamin D diminishes. But experts do commonly recommend 1,000 to 3,000 IUs a day for adults. And we are on our very last section, step 12. And step 12 is important. It seems obvious, and it is obvious, but it's really important to achieve and maintain a healthy body weight. In fact, if we look at the definition of diabetes reversal, in order to reverse diabetes, we're talking about normal blood glucose levels for at least a year without any medications. And that you will not accomplish if you don't achieve and maintain a healthy body weight. So that's critical. So about 80 to 90% of people with type 2 diabetes are overweight or obese. And even a weight loss of 5 to 10% of initial body weight can improve insulin sensitivity, glycemic control, blood pressure, and dyslipidemia in people with type 2 diabetes. The restoration of a healthy body weight may reverse diabetes in some individuals and probably in a good number of individuals if they're doing it correctly. So the key strategies for getting a handle on this and promoting healthy weight loss are energy restriction and physical activity. Of course, the obvious way to lose weight is through energy restriction, and we basically have to produce an energy deficit, which could be achieved by exercising more and by eating less. But for most people, it's hard to do it just through exercising more. You usually need to weave in the eating less part of the equation. The most common approaches are continuous energy restriction with very low energy diets or low energy diets, and fasting or modified fasting is a second option. Very low energy diets, we have preliminary evidence suggesting remission of diabetes can be achieved with, an 8-week very low energy diet, and we're looking at 600 calories a day, or a 3 to 5 month low energy diet around the 850 calories a day. And this treatment actually has been shown to be acceptable and feasible for very highly motivated patients. And of course, you can do easier low energy diet, possibly 1,400 calories a day, and get results. But of course, the results will be significantly slower. And then the other way of doing it is fasting and modified fasting. Both of these, I would say, should really only be carried out under the supervision of a physician because it's risky, and it's especially risky for people who are on medication, so they need to be followed very closely. Most of them would get off medication pretty quickly, so it gets a little easier. So there are 3 popular variations on modified fasting. First being time-restricted feeding, second intermittent fasting, and third periodic fasting. And time-restricted feeding is really just limiting the number of hours in a day where you're going to actually be eating. You've got this little window of time in a 24-hour period. So a lot of people do this now where they stop eating after supper and try to wait at least 12 or 14 hours before eating their breakfast, giving their body a long rest period. Now, some people do more intense time-restricted feeding, and they will go up to 18 hours. So they're only eating for 6 hours. They might only have 1 or 2 meals. So that's one option. The second option is intermittent fasting. And intermittent fasting is really a type of modified fast that involves full day fast on specific days of the week. And there are all sorts of different regimes, like the 6-1 regime means 6 days of eating and 1 day of fasting or modified fasting per week. The 5-2 regime is 5 days of eating, 2 days of fasting. And then there are even more aggressive ways of doing this, like alternate day fasting, where you do a fast or modified fast every other day. And of course, you can do this by doing a water fast or by doing a modified low-calorie kind of diet, or juice fast for that matter. There was a study of continuous energy restriction versus intermittent fasting, and this was a study looking at 12 to 1500 calorie diet and comparing that to 2 days of severe energy restriction, 4 to 600 calories a day each week, which of course is the 5-2 approach. And over a 12-week period, the 5-2 program was just as effective as continuous energy restriction for weight loss and glycemic control. For some people, it's easier, I think, to eat a little bit more liberally for 5 days and then to have 2 days where they're restricting, as opposed to restricting every single day, even though it's a more moderate restriction. And then the third type of modified fast is called periodic fasting, and it's a type of fasting based on extended periods of fasting, such as 4 or 5 days or more periodic, for example, once a month. And it can be done as a water fast, juice fast, or a very low calorie modified fast. And probably the most popular of all of the periodic fasting regimes is called the fasting mimicking diet, which is a diet that was developed by Dr. Walter Longo, a longevity expert from the University of Southern California. The fasting mimicking diets are basically a cycle of 5 days of this fast, which is a diet that's designed to reduce calories. It's about 40% of your usual calorie intake, and it's sort of low enough calories to reap the therapeutic benefits of fasting. It's followed for 5 days a month or less frequently. You can do 3 or 4 times a year, but generally you want to do at least 3 cycles. So you might do 3 months in a row, for example, for reversal of diabetes. Evidence suggests that it produces significant reductions in body weight, blood glucose, CRP, and insulin resistance. And there is even some preliminary evidence suggesting beta cell regeneration and diabetes reversal using this type of program. Something that we just want to keep our ears open for, because it really is quite interesting. And then the other thing we want to do is to eat less calorically dense foods. And if you look at this list, you can see oil, cheese, donuts, spam, fried chicken, all have a lot of calories per gram of food. So you would get a lot of calories in a small amount of food. Whereas with plant foods, whole plant foods, from beans down to lettuce, there's just not a lot of calories per gram of food. So you can eat a large volume of food and feel more satisfied with what you're eating. And so that is very helpful for people trying to lose weight, because you can feel quite hungry otherwise. And then, of course, drink water, not sugar. Basically, the bottom line here is you really want to be consuming your calories as solid foods more than as liquids, because liquids do not register satiety the same as what solid foods do. So you could drink a lot of calories and not feel full at all. You're better off eating an apple than drinking apple juice. That's just the reality. Even when you're eating super healthy food, you need to control your intake of concentrated carbohydrate sources like grains, starchy vegetables, and dried fruits, and concentrated fat sources like nuts and seeds and avocados and olives and coconut. So those are the foods that you need to be moderate in your portions with. I would say it's a really good idea to avoid snacking. You want to aim for at least 4 to 6 hours between meals. And if you're hungry, drink water or herbal tea. And if you must snack, stick to raw vegetables or fresh fruits, just trying to keep caloric intake low. I think people that eat more regularly often get more calories throughout the day. So this is one way to put a lid on the total calorie intake for the day. And this one is kind of interesting. We used to always say scales are for fish and don't be weighing all the time. That's not healthy. We have since learned that self-monitoring of body weight leads to improved long-term weight maintenance. And I think of this for people that I know that seem to weigh the same at 80 years of age as they did when they were a teenager. They just never gain weight. The people that I know that are like that, many of them are daily weighers. As soon as their weight starts to creep up a bit, they just don't have the dessert. They just eat less. And it's an effective means of long-term weight maintenance. So just something to think about. And of course, physical activity is hugely important. And I would say start where your patients are at, but what you want to aim for is eventually 60 minutes a day is the goal. And I know a lot of people say, 30 minutes 3 times a week, it's not enough. And it seems more and more the experts and the guidelines are recommending more than that as well. We can start with a 15-minute walk and increase it to a 30-minute. And one of the nice things is it doesn't have to be all at once. It can be that, you walk after meals for 10 minutes even, and then you do a little half hour of. The ADA recommendations for physical activity in type 2 diabetes are to decrease the amount of time you spend being sedentary. You want to interrupt prolonged sitting with bouts of activity every 30 minutes. You want to do daily exercise, including both aerobic and resistance, and you should do structured exercise for at least 150 minutes a week. And that's it for the 12 steps. And I know that there were some things that were repeated in various steps, but hopefully the points all got across. The bottom line is eat whole plant foods and select the healthiest whole plant foods that you can find and try to minimize your intake of everything else. So that's it in a nutshell. And so now we're going to take a little bit of time on a couple of practical things. One will be looking at what to eat in terms of specific foods for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And then we will also talk a little bit about the case study and how you would deal with a particular individual, where diet is concerned, of course. So what to eat now that we know what we know? For breakfast, what we want to do is find out, first of all, does a person prefer savory or sweet breakfast? If they're a savory person, then you really need to use your imagination. Scrambled tofu with a lot of vegetables is a good option, but it's way lower in fiber than some of the other options. So then you have to say, okay, how do we get the fiber in? Do we do it with a slice of the bread you can stand on, or with, some sort of chia pudding with a bunch of flaxseed added, or what do we do? The other option is a savory breakfast bowl, like a steel cut oat that is done savory style with beans and greens and all of that. And it's quite a lovely breakfast. In the Marshall Islands, we did a lot of beans and greens, and people loved beans and greens. You put a little something creamy in there, like some sort of milk, cashew milk or coconut milk. We're a little careful with coconut milk. We would make our own in the Marshall Islands. It's a real traditional food, but homemade coconut milk is much lower in fat than canned coconut milk. If you are into more sweet breakfasts, there are a lot of options as well. One of the things, if you do a breakfast bowl, is to use intact grains. So my breakfast bowl, for example, would be kamut berries or some other intact whole grain like oat groats or barley. I even purchased some black barley, so there can be some fun little things in there. One of the things that you can experiment with is adding lentils to the grains when they're cooking. And they can be regular large lentils, or they can be tiny little red or black lentils. So the lentils add quite a boost of fiber, iron, zinc, and so forth. So it can be a great addition to a breakfast bowl. And then adding fruit. I like something creamy in my breakfast bowl, so I make a cashew pear cream or a non-dairy yogurt. But the other thing you can do that's super simple is a chia pudding. And a chia pudding, the way I make mine is I just mix about 2.5 tablespoons of chia seed into a cup of non-dairy milk. And then I add in a few drops of vanilla. I don't put any sugar or sweetener at all. And I just let it sit overnight, and that's a base of a breakfast bowl. And you still add in your whole grains. You can add in all your fruit, berries, and so forth. The other thing that can make these dishes really, really nice is to do stewed fruit. So I do a lot of stewed fruit in the summertime and freeze it. And you do this by adding just the tiniest bit of water into a pot, letting it cook on the lowest temperature until the fruit is covered in its own juice. There's nothing added except the fruit and a few drops of water. And then you'll see a few other things pictured here. You see a buckwheat granola in the center upper part of this picture. And then on the left-hand side, what you're seeing there is a green smoothie bowl. And this is something that is super simple to make and is really quite delicious. And with a smoothie bowl, you can put on some grains. You can put on buckwheat or quinoa, some seeds like chia seeds, hemp seeds. You can put in, some fruit on top, and then it just all gets stirred into your green smoothie. And the green smoothie, what I would suggest is to do a fair bit of protein in it. So you might use some hemp seeds. You could use some soft tofu. One of the other things, which is going to sound a little odd, that I always put into a smoothie is frozen peas. And the frozen peas give it this extraordinarily beautiful green color, but it also adds a lot of fiber and protein. And so that makes a nice addition too. And then just a ton of greens. You want, whatever dark green leafies, kale, and so forth in there. And some sort of non-dairy milk, like a fortified cashew milk, works very well, or soy milk, but unsweetened. Whenever you're using a non-dairy milk, you don't want your patients having the added sugar, so unsweetened. And so that's a pretty easy thing to do and kind of fun as well.
So next, soups and salads. I think that it's great for people to recognize the value of soups and salads for lunches or dinners. And another point that I think is really important to make is that ideally dinner should be light and lunch should be featuring more substantial main dishes. That would be ideal. We don't want to be eating as much food at night when we're not going to be burning off the calories. And another thing I think that is really valuable to recognize is salads should not be lettuce, cucumbers, and tomatoes. We can make salads to be absolutely wonderful full meals simply by adding something of substance. And so you could add, quinoa or kamut berries, or you could add some steamed sweet potato or butternut squash cubes, and then some sort of protein source like beans or tofu cubes. And also where salads are concerned, one of my main goals when I make a salad is to include a vegetable that covers every color in the rainbow. And that really can make an ideal salad. The other thing not to forget is you do not want to just put a non-nutritious dressing like a sugar-based dressing on top, which gives you nothing. The ideal would be to use nuts or seeds or avocados to make a blended dressing. You don't need any added oils or sugars, just the nuts and seeds and maybe some lemon or lime or vinegar, and you can make an absolutely beautiful dressing. You can add, of course, fresh garlic, fresh turmeric, fresh ginger to add extra phytochemicals as well. And then in the upper right, when you're heading off to work, you can bring a layered salad in a mason jar, which makes a really nice complete lunch. And then when you're making soups, again, think beans and vegetables, and you can easily get a lot of the legumes you're eating in a day in this form, which is really quite wonderful. So when it comes to main dishes, which again, ideally you'd be serving at our what we might call our lunch meal, but for some people, from a practical perspective, it's going to be a dinner meal because they're out of the home at lunchtime. But ideally, if you're able to do it, keep your dinner light, your lunch a little more hearty. So when you start thinking about options for these meals, one of my very favorite is, some people call them glory bowls, some people call them Buddha bowls or veggie bowls or whatever. But basically you have a base of some sort of carbohydrate like quinoa or butternut squash. And then you would have steamed vegetables, a variety of steamed vegetables ideally, and including all the colors, and then your protein on top, maybe a few sprouts or some seeds on top of that, and then a good dressing. And certainly the dressings you make for your salads could be used on these bowls as well. You can do something like collard wraps, or if you want a more traditional meal like a lentil loaf, which can be served with baked sweet potatoes and a kale salad, for example. You can do a stir fry with tofu. You can do ethnic dishes like, curries and Mexican dishes like tamale pie with, the bean and tomato base and the cornmeal topping. There are all sorts of very hearty main dishes that you can do, and they can be completely plant-based without any added fats or sugars and be absolutely delicious.
And then desserts, you don't need dessert if you can get away with it, but if you really love dessert, fruit makes your best dessert, and you can have it with nuts or nut butter. Take a few walnuts in the shell and just crack them open with an apple or an orange or whatever. You can also do some raw desserts which have no sugar added, like the apple pie up there. That would be a really special treat because it's high in calories. But fruit salads with pear cashew cream would be lovely. In the bottom center, you see a blueberry ice cream. All it is frozen bananas and frozen blueberries put through either a processor, a blender, or a juicer. And then on the other side, you see a chia pudding or a non-dairy yogurt kind of parfait thing. There are lots of options for healthy desserts. And then beverages, if you're doing any sort of juice, I would say stick to green juice, all sorts of herbal teas. Fruit waters, vegetable waters are great. Cucumber water or water with a bit of berries in it just gives the water a bit of flavor and makes it more fun. So that's an option too. And then to think about the implementation and maintaining, and that's the challenge for people. We need to first take stock of our situation. So our eating patterns, our health status, medications, sleeping patterns, stress level, set goals, write down reasons for the goals, develop a plan of action. And I think probably one of the most important things of all is to put a support system in place. So many people say this is pretty hard to do because my family's not doing it, but you need to create an additional little tribe that's doing what you're doing so that you can get the kind of support you need and have people to talk to. And then really think about restocking your pantry. Even if your family is not so much in favor of it, getting them on board would be a huge help. Just give away foods that don't support your health goals and purchase items that do. Educate yourself and keep educating yourself. Go to conferences, listen to videos, or Mastering Diabetes Summit. There's just a lot of things online that could be very beneficial. The bottom line is that profound lifestyle changes are safe and effective treatments for type 2 diabetes and other lifestyle-induced diseases. And I think as health professionals, it's really time for a call to action. We've got to make lifestyle medicine the first line of therapy for people with lifestyle-induced diseases. It seems like a no-brainer, but it's just not happening as much as it should be happening. And it's really time for healthcare systems to offer treatment programs that reflect our current state of knowledge and food services that support health rather than undermining it. It's an embarrassment when I think about what is served in hospitals. It's just beyond belief that we're serving people foods that we know are strongly associated to disease risk and to the risk of complications of disease, and it's got to stop. We need to start feeding people in hospitals food that will actually support their health and healing. So let's move on to talking a little bit about how you would advise the following patient. This is called Your Patient, Your Advice. So here's your patient. Her name is Barbara Smith. She's 51 years of age. She has been a vegetarian for 8 years. She's overweight at 5'3" and 164 pounds. Her BMI is 29 at the upper end of the overweight zone. Her diagnosis, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol, high triglycerides, polycystic ovarian syndrome, and depression. So this is something that I'm sure you see all the time, but she is a motivated patient who wants help.
So her current lifestyle, she has a very high-stress job as a high school biology department head. As we mentioned, she'd been lacto-ovo vegetarian for 8 years. Not a lot of physical activity other than walking and standing in school and going for walks once on the weekends for about 45 minutes. She doesn't have any sort of formal exercise programs in place. She does have disturbed sleep patterns, and she's married with 2 college-age children who are no longer at home. She does most of the cooking and housework.
So here's her typical diet. Breakfast is bran flakes, a banana, 2% milk, and coffee with cream. Her lunch is a sandwich with regular cheese, mayo, pickles, tomatoes on a whole wheat bagel. She has raw carrots and celery and an apple and iced tea with artificial sweetener for lunch. That's just a typical lunch.
And for dinner, she might have something like a fajita with a white tortilla, chicken, veggie meat, stir-fried peppers and onions, salsa, guacamole, a green salad with ranch dressing, a glass of red wine, and vegan ice cream. Again, this is just an example of one of her typical meals.
And she has snacks just once a day, and they would be something like crackers and peanut butter, trail mix, dark chocolate, energy bars, and popcorn. So that gives you a bit of an idea. So what suggestions would you make to reverse type 2 diabetes and other chronic health conditions that Barbara has? So the recommended responses here would be that there's a very high probability that Barbara's conditions are all reversible. And we've seen it time and time again. Of course, we would be recommending 100% whole food plant-based diet without any added oils or sugars. And she could start in a number of ways with some sort of modified fasting diet. It could be fasting mimicking diet, intermittent fasting, periodic fasting. We would say probably if she did fasting mimicking, it would be at least 3 cycles. And then she could step down to the time-restricted feeding or intermittent fasting. But I think time-restricted feeding would be fine. And then step 3 would be a maintenance diet, which would be 100% whole food plant-based diet that would be energy appropriate. And we'd have to just see where she's at. She's fairly young at 51, so she may be able to do 1,800 calories or something like that once the weight is gone. So step 1, the fasting mimicking diet would be 3 cycles or more, 5 days a month, 600 to 1,000 calories a day, whole food plant-based. And we'd do 2 meals. We could do a morning meal between 8 and 11 a.m. and an evening meal around 2 to 5 p.m. 6 to 8 a.m. she could have a hot beverage with turmeric, ginger, lemon. And then at 8 to 10, she would have a breakfast bowl with cooked oat groats, berries, grated apple, and then the seeds, unsweetened non-dairy milk. And the dinner from 2 to 5 could be a large salad with dark green sprouts, lots of veggies, beans, steamed butternut squash, and then a healthy dressing. And then her beverages would be mainly water and herbal tea. And then the remaining 25 days of the cycle would be a moderate 16 to 1,800 calorie maintenance diet. And we do at least 3 of those. And then other lifestyle changes, we would definitely have to kick up the physical activity. So 15 to 30-minute walks after meals, or as much as she could do, and a 30 to 60-minute stretch daily. And maybe she could take up yoga. And she needs to step up her rest as well, take steps to improve the quality and quantity of her sleep, as we need to get her to about 7 to 8 hours per night if possible. And then stress management, and that could be whatever appeals to her, whether it's yoga, deep breathing, meditation, massage, prayer, whatever works for her, at least 2 to 3 times a week. And then step 2 would be the time-restricted feeding. And the suggested protocol here would be until weight and health goals are met, she would be doing 1,000 to 1,500 calories per day of a whole food plant-based diet and at least 12 to 16 hours of a fast each day as well. And here she could do a beverage between 6 and 7 a.m. like she did on the fasting mimicking. And then breakfast between 7 and 9. It would be a breakfast bowl with all the goodies. And 1 to 2, she would have her lunch, which would be a large salad, with all the greens and so forth. And 5 to 7, she could have a light dinner like a green smoothie or a soup or other light meal. So that would basically cover it. And step 3 would be maintenance, and here the suggested protocol would be a lifelong whole food plant-based diet rich in fiber, antioxidants, and anti-inflammatory compounds. And we would be doing 3 meals a day with no snacks, strive for at least 12-hour fast between dinner and breakfast, somewhere between 16 and 2,000 calories a day to achieve whatever she needs to achieve energy balance. Water and herbal teas as beverages, and she would have her breakfast between 7 and 9, lunch noon to 2, and dinner between 5 and 7. And I think that would pretty much cover it. And other lifestyle changes, well, just the other lifestyle changes we implemented in step 2 would seem appropriate. And other considerations are that we need to ensure that the diet is nutritionally adequate. So we've got to give consideration to vitamin B12, iodine in her case, vitamin D, iron, zinc, calcium, and omega-3 fatty acids. So if she needs supplements, then we would need to advise the use of supplements. And we would want to work closely with Barbara to develop a long-term plan that works for her from both a personal and practical perspective.
In summary, we named 4 products of high temperature cooking that have adverse consequences for health and their primary sources, listed at least 7 ways of boosting the antioxidant and phytochemical content of the diet, and gave at least 3 suggestions for reducing calories without compromising nutrition in any given diet.
This brings part 3, the final part of this module, to